Hello, brothers, and welcome to Heroic Stories. It's a series to strengthen Catholic men with real stories of heroic grit and faith, and it's brought to you from heroicmen.org. I'm your host, Dominic from Heroic Men. Each week, I sit down with a guest to ask them how they made it through their darkest moments, who their heroes were, and who they want to be a hero for. These are real men who've battled doubt, they've sought purpose, and they've changed their lives in ways that can inspire you and me to do the same. These are the stories that remind us that heroism isn't born, it's made. Hello, men, and welcome back to Heroic Stories. I'm privileged to be joined today by Deacon Eric Paige. Hello, Deacon. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Dominic.
It's good to have you with us. We got four major questions we're going to get into in a moment, but you are yourself a deacon, and you work in the formation of deacons and those in diaconate lay ministry. Is that right?
Yeah, supporting deacons, supporting deacons in formation, and also helping out with supporting lay ministers.
Excellent. So we'll probably come back to some of that. What I'd like to kick off with, this is how we start the show, is I ask, what is a story of heroism that absolutely lights you up? So when somebody talks about heroic people or heroic men, this comes to mind, and it could be from the news or maybe your own personal life or somebody you know or a story. What's a heroic story that lights you up?
Well, I'm probably going to have to give you a couple, because I'm going to
ahead.
go the first place that is probably, you get this a lot, is of course our Lord. You know, the reason I mention that is just something we've just got to speak to is there's a wonderful saint, Louis de Montfort, who talked about how every person is ultimately painting their life on a canvas, but the model is Jesus. And in one way or another, we're trying to find out, what has God called me to do to live like Jesus? When you start to think about our Lord, it's mind-boggling, because you realize, he had the fullness of divinity, but he also chose to be fully human. And so there's something beautiful about our humanity, but we're also called to something else. And, so pointing to kind of a little bit more accessible type of model, I kind of lean on St. Catherine of Siena sometimes. I mean, like so many people,
Say why.
go from one person to the next, but she just had this irrepressible love of God, and she was just so filled with energy by her love for him, and she had such a pure love for him from an early age. And of course, most of us, we have to kind of work to get that purification later in life, but you see in her life just this irrepressible positivity, a sense of humor, a willingness to move past unfair things that were done to her, because she endured a great deal of that. She overcame extraordinary limitations in that she wasn't literate. She didn't write, but I mean, she was incredibly bright, but she used people to help her transcribe what she had to say. Her relationships with the people around her were so incredibly powerful, that she really kind of transformed the city in many ways. And she also really called the Pope at the time to conversion in a really important way. So she's just a great model that power, that energy, and brought into life in such a perfect way.
So I'm really curious to ask, why someone like that, why that brilliant, powerful, fiery personality, why does that resonate so much with you? Is there a story there?
I would say that you're going to get a different answer from me on a different day, which person inspires me. On some days you're going to get like Abraham Lincoln, another person, same kind of energy and navigating the time that he lived in. But I do feel like, at least today, I feel so called to her, because she lived in this complex, shifting time. I mean, they were dealing with things like plague, of course, much more difficult plague than we dealt with. A really changing culture at the time, as people were moving from the rural life to the towns, that more and more people were using writing as a way to communicate. It was a shifting time, and it was kind of an upsetting time too, because of the sort of Babylonian captivity of the papacy at the time. Things just didn't seem right. And, there's so much good going on in our world right now. There really is. But there's a lot of stuff that it's tough to make sense of. And her example of kind of strong positivity is just so compelling, because, whatever time she lived in, she would come through as a saint. It wouldn't matter. And for us to follow that example is really important, I think, to say, okay, we don't live in an ideal time, but we're going to come through as a saint nonetheless.
So this might lead into my very next question, which is to ask, what is one of the hardest decisions that you've ever had to make? And
I
maybe
mean,
we'll go there and then I'll
yeah.
maybe come back.
So I'll go back in time a little bit for this one, back to when I had just recently graduated from graduate school. I studied public administration at the University of Pennsylvania, and I grew up out here and came back out here because I love working with state and local government, was interested in public affairs, and was working for the state of Washington as a legislative liaison. And I was a city council member in our city and had been considering political life. I had thought about running for the House of Representatives and was kind of considering if I'm going to go that path. And at the time, I remember I was up in the Senate gallery sitting next to the director of our state Catholic conference. The state Catholic conference here in Washington and in every state represents the bishops of the state. And it's a really interesting job, live in this, point between the political world and the world of faith. And it's a really challenging and interesting job. And I remember Ned Gillespie, he was the director at the time, and he said, hey, I'm taking the position as the director of the California Catholic Conference. Have you ever thought of working with the church? And at that time, I had not really considered it. I'd always been on the path with public administration and the political world, and loved that work, found it very rewarding. It sounds like it's a little bit less rewarding these days, but I really love that world. And this invitation, though, just kind of sat with me, like, do I want to go with this route? Do I want to consider this step? And because it would mean, if I'm working with the church, setting out everything else aside. Early in life, when everything had been kind of planned out for me, or it seemed like a clear path, this would be an unclear path. And I did take that path ultimately, and it made an enormous amount of difference. I'm grateful that I did, but it was a really challenging decision.
Yeah, gosh, I can only imagine. Now I can understand the appeal or the inspiration of St. Catherine then, to the kind of man that you were training yourself or setting yourself up to become. So I would like to dig a little more into, you said ultimately it was a very hard decision, you made your way through it, but in the moment, like, what was it that put you over the edge, or that made it feel like, as hard as this is obviously a decision I have to make? What was going on at that point?
There's this kind of process I think we all go through where we spend much of our lives thinking about the temporal world and about how do I get by from day to day? How do I navigate the world of human beings? But in our heart, there's this call to the divine. There's this call to God's path, and hopefully we hear it early. Now, going back to our example of St. Catherine, she heard it when she was a little girl. She heard it loud and clear, and she followed immediately. That's part of what so admirable about her. But at the time, for me, I was really comfortable with the temporal world. That made sense. That was measurable, trackable. I had my faith and I loved my faith. But going into a world of really working for the church specifically means that all of a sudden, okay, you're leaving the things you're most familiar with, and your ultimate call, your ultimate destination it's not clear, because we can't fully picture what God has planned for us. We're always going to be going off into an unknown place. I think of Luke 5, where Jesus calls St. Peter and he says, go out into the deep water. And St. Peter is thinking, like, I don't know what that is. What's out there, But that's where we're sent usually. And that's part of what made it tricky.
So was it literally the sense that I don't know the next step, but this is the right decision that I have to make? Or did you see a glimmer of, like, okay, I could, like, what you described was a very calculating, prudent mind, could have, weighing all the options, and then you're given this other call to sort of cast out into the deep. Did you find a way to be able to make new prudent decisions to make it all work? Or was it literally just diving off and just trusting something would open up?
There's a little bit of both,
Yeah.
you do your process of, thinking things through, consider the pros and cons, you have to consider how's this going to play out in terms of the logistics and the practical questions. And of course, I was married and still am, but you're going to consult with your wife, and she's going to have something to say about it. But it was a great process, and ultimately I accepted that path, which continually led to other things. But it wasn't all clear where all this was going to lead. It was a departure and a certain act of trust.
Kidding. Well, in a minute, I want to ask you who your favorite heroes are, men you admire and want to model. But before we do that, let's talk about what you're actually doing today in the formation of, with the diaconate and the deacons and lay ministry and all of this. It's stuff that's very close to our heart as well with heroic men. It's kind of how you and I were introduced through a connection, Chris Mann, who works at Heroic Men. So let's talk about what you do now and why does it matter to you?
Well, it matters a lot. Part of it is because as a deacon, I promised obedience to my bishop and his successors, which that's part of the experience of obedience is you're not just promising obedience to the bishop who ordains you, but to all those who follow him. And, you get called to ask to do something. And so part of it is you want to do that. And there is a joy in just doing it because it's what you've been asked to do. But I also love it because the deacons that I get to work with, these are just great guys. I mean, these are people who decided, I am going to dedicate my life to serving God. I'm going to stay also engaged in the temporal world, in service as a caretaker for my family, as a participant in the life of the world. But I'm also going to be formed and obedient to the bishop, and I'm going to live in that place of kind of healthy tension. And there's a really important role for deacons in supporting and helping to animate the ministries of lay people. In other words, calling people who are, Catholics to find a deeper engagement with Christ in their care for their family and their care for the community. And that's part of the joy of it, is this kind of process of saying, how do we do this? What do we do in terms of formation? We pay a lot of attention in formation to what are sometimes referred to as the 4 dimensions of formation. And it's kind of helpful, I think, for all of us. You're going to pay attention to what's called the intellectual part of our formation, really understanding the faith and being able to engage it. We're going to pay attention to the pastoral formation, and that's about kind of how do you do it? What are you supposed to do when you actually go out and serve as a deacon? How do you celebrate a funeral? How do you go and do prison ministry? Mm-hmm. There's different elements of deacon formation. And then there's spiritual formation, which is really rich and really powerful and, of course, very challenging. And then I have a particular focus in my contributions to the formation program in human formation. It's this type of formation that helps us find our identity as a human being, as someone who's embodied, as someone who serves God in this world and loves God in this world, and also has to really understand who we are in order to receive Him.
I'd love to understand a bit more about that. So you said specifically human formation, the human condition. Could you say just a little bit more about that? I've not heard of that as a discipline or a spiritual
recent.
practice.
It was introduced into priestly and diaconal formation by Pope John Paul II, and it's remained there since then. And it really includes a focus on truly understanding who we are as a human being. And you have to realize, okay, I'm called by God to engage with Him, but to engage with Him as a person with my body, with my time that I live in. I'm bound by where I live and when I live there. Like for instance, in my case, my ordination is to the Archdiocese of Seattle. So, I'm kind of going to serve here. So I have to understand the people that are here and be able to engage with the people that are here rather than the people that I might pick from one day to the next. And then there's this real need to develop virtue. In particular, in human formation, we focus on the 4 cardinal virtues. Prudence, in other words, knowing what's really good for us. I mean, really good for us, not, necessarily being clever, and certainly not like Machiavelli, but we'll go back to our friend St. Catherine of Siena, someone who She knew her deepest need was to be with God and to follow Him. Is understanding that, and then justice, knowing what's the right thing to do for the people that I'm encountering, for what's my duty to God, what's my duty to my country, what's my duty to the people around me, and then fortitude, the courage to continue doing work even when it's difficult. And in every person's experience, of course, it is going to be difficult a lot of the time. And then finally, one that's particularly challenging for our time now is self-control or temperance, and being able to say, okay, I can see that that's interesting, but I don't need to pursue that. I don't need to click on that link. I don't need to eat that extra piece of cake. That's another important virtue. So those are important elements of human formation.
Wow, amazing. Thank you for that. You actually said something intriguing earlier. You talked about obedience and living in a healthy tension of that obedience. I think there's a point at which deacons are living that out, that perhaps charism, in a way that's different to the rest of us married men, where, well, we have a different tension with family and wife and sort of our relation to the church and so on. But you now have taken it to a level of, or a practical sort of discipline that's beyond what the rest of us are kind of practicing. And so I'm curious to maybe get a peek under the hood about how do you do that? How do you make sense of that? Like you say, it's not just to the person of a bishop, but to the position, and to almost be wedded to the community of a people, of an area, I think is what it seemed you were saying.
No, you're onto something there. And it's a challenging thing because we tend to, in our modern culture, we tend to deal with things by saying like, okay, I've got this area of my life where I'm going to spend this time at work, and then while I'm there, I'm a little compartmentalized. I'm at work here, so I do whatever I'm supposed to do in my company, and I work within the company, and that's my context. And then I switch and I go and I spend time with my family, for the allotted time with my family. And that's what I do during that time. And then I've got time for other kinds of recreation that I might choose to do, and that's sort of the framework that's commonly used in our life, but it leads to kind of a divided life, if you will. In other words, you find yourself often saying like, well, how do I balance work versus family? How do I balance my free time versus my time with the kids? And what obedience calls us to do is say, okay, my ultimate obedience is to God, but I'm going to be expressing that through a life of service. So I have made a commitment to my wife. When I was married, I promised God that I would care for, and then when I baptized children, I promised God that I would care for these children. And then if you're ordained as a deacon, you're promising God you're going to serve the church and serve the bishop, and you're continually working to try to have an integration of your life. In other words, that everything's ultimately flowing from your relationship with God and is understood through those relationships. But that means a ton of communication, one with whoever you're responding to is the bishop's representative, and your family, and navigating your workplace as well, and trying to do all those things in a way where you're really serving and you're at the pleasure of those people, but not in such a way that you lose track of what am I supposed to be doing, and do I feel like this is bringing joy into my life?
Yeah. How would you answer a thought or a question like this? I bet there are a lot of men out there who feel like you sometimes get lost as a person. You get lost in your role, and the demands of your role, and the limitations on your time, and then everything stacks up. And then there comes a moment where you're like, I'm a ghost in this machine, and I'm not attended to, and maybe I feel like I'm missing out on life, and the rebellion, desire to, not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes maybe it's a matter of you're struggling with that because we haven't learned to balance.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's a whole conversation. I'm just curious, someone like you, it sounds like you've chosen to take on a set of responsibilities and disciplines, and to navigate a ton of other people compared to someone like me. Just, I've got one family, and you're taking on a whole lot more. How do you make sense of or navigate maybe feeling like you're buried alive under, maybe you don't feel like this. And if you don't, I'd love to understand how. I think there's a lot of men who feel like we're buried alive by a lot of the life and responsibilities. And how do you talk to men who are feeling like that? and if that resonates with you.
Yeah, well, it does. And I think we have to just be honest and admit that in our time, it's incredibly difficult to feel at peace because we're in a very kind of almost experimental time in that the technologies and the resources we've developed have really done a lot of wonderful things. I mean, our communication right now is being facilitated by new technology. It's absolutely beautiful. This is a great resource. And at the same time, it's really changed the dynamic. I mean, I remember when I was a kid and I would walk home from school, you always had silence. You were walking home in silence. Most of what you were doing, you had to go to some effort to have something going on that might distract you. And I remember as a kid sometimes just feeling like, I wish there was more entertainment around me. Well, unfortunately, that wish has been granted. I mean, we can literally pull a phone out of our pocket and it's a supercomputer. And, but that's not the only place where the distractions are. I mean, I find at work, one of the things that's is kind of challenging is you're pinged by email, you're pinged by text, you're pinged by Teams. If you use Microsoft, there's other tools. So there's all these different ways to get in touch with people, and everybody's using these tools to try to get our attention. That our attention's been commodified, which means that you get home and you want to be fully present, but even there, it's a challenge to be fully present, both for your children and for your wife and for you, because there's all these different things that are trying to reach us at home, even work. It's really challenging. And it's challenging for all of us. I would be lying if I said, you know what? I've reached the mountaintop and this is what it's like. But I have found that, really switching those things off and spending time in prayer it's just the key to feeling like things are integrated. Having that time of silence. I mean, we're really blessed as deacons in that we're required to do morning and evening prayer. It's
Really?
promise you
Okay.
make an ordination. And over time, I've gotten busier and I've realized that I need to expand my amount of time in morning and evening prayer. And it's the more time I add to it, the more at peace I am, even though there's less time for other things. It's just absolutely critical. And taking the steps that I've needed to do to kind of set aside these different kinds of distraction, create an environment where it's not easy for them to distract me. Like when my wife and I are having dinner, the phones are away. They're at a different spot, because if those phones are too close to you, it's going to be distracting. Same thing we try to do with our kids. We were parents who drove our kids crazy because we would not let them have their phones in their bedrooms.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they want to have the phones in their bedrooms, but they don't really appreciate life if they do have it, because it's just really distracting. And we have to create the same dynamic for ourselves where there is time of peace, there is time for reflection.
Amazing. Favorite movie? Spot question. And don't say The Passion of the Christ, because that's a lot of ours, but
Oh my gosh, it depends on the day when you ask me. Okay, I wish I had high cinema that came to mind right now, but the movie that I was thinking about just recently, I was talking with my daughter and son-in-law about this, we had so much fun seeing the movie Gladiator. Now,
the first or the second one?
The first one, forget the second one. That second one just was way too much. I mean, we saw the second one and we thought that was a cash grab, we didn't enjoy it.
Okay.
And the first one had a little bit more stabbing that you would like to see, but I mean, when the title's Gladiator, I should have been warned. But it was just a visually fascinating film because you got to see a picture of what it would have been like to live in that period. It moves from all these different times, very compellingly. There's it starts out in that German forest and then it moves to somewhere in I think Algiers or something like that. But, and then it's, to Rome. And so you're just continually seeing a lot of things that are different and a compelling story in a lot of ways. So that's today's favorite. You ask me something for tomorrow's, it'll be different.
Okay. It's one of my favorites too, for sure. Okay. Who are men, and this sort of is a segue maybe from a movie like, about Maximus, but who are men that you deeply admire, and they could be historical figures or they could be real men that you know, who are heroes that you wish you could emulate or you desire to?
I've named a lot of saints, and I could keep naming saints. That I mean, one of my favorites, honestly, I just can't avoid sharing him, is Saint Michael and his commitment to his love for God and his love for us. Is because of that love. That's a compelling saint for me in so many ways. St. Thomas Aquinas, his genius is compelling to me in so many ways. But I'll kind of point to a person that I really admire that's a little bit more current, and that's Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was such an incredible president, and his faith life wasn't as defined as it could have been. Part of that had to do with his time and place, but he had this incredible gift for navigating complex and difficult environments where, just like our time, a lot of change at that time, and really pulling together people that would have otherwise been at odds with one another. And of
Wow.
course, he
Okay.
dealt with one of the most bloody wars that we've ever had on our
On American
continent.
soil, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he navigated that time and kept the nation together and moved towards a much more just place, in such a challenging environment and a time much more divided than ours.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. Okay. So you've listed St. Catherine of Siena, Abraham Lincoln, and well, there's Maximus a little bit. Anybody else you'd like to add to that roster?
Let's see. There's a couple of people that just kind of come to mind right now. One is another Viktor Frankl. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Man's
How
Search for
interesting.
Meaning.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Chris Mann, and we've read the book as well, Man's Search for Meaning.
he was just such a great example of someone who encountered the worst of humanity.
And for those who've not read the book, could you give us a quick overview of Victor
Sure.
and his life?
So he was a great psychologist, really great psychologist. And his third Vienna School of Psychology, I think, is better than all the others, but we won't go into that right now. But he was, during the Second World War, a Jewish man taken into captivity and suffered brutally during the Holocaust, and wrote Man's Search for Meaning to describe what it was like to be imprisoned in a concentration camp and how he maintained hope and was still a positive influence on the people around him in that impossible place. And, a contrary example, another great man in many ways, but Elie Wiesel, he writes Night, a different kind of novel of his experience, and he writes about how the experience broke him, how it really left him only seeing dark things, and he had to recover from that. But Viktor Frankl was able to keep his eyes on the prize, so to speak, and to be continually moving through that difficult situation in a way that actually lifted the people up. And he even describes in his book of moments of kindness, even from the guards he encountered in the concentration camp. And seeing good in people who are doing such evil is really just an amazing feat of, humanity.
Incredible. Thank you for that. Last question then is, who are people that you desire then to be a hero for? As I mentioned earlier, let's avoid the God card and avoid the family card, because obviously these are those who matter most to us. But now we want to push beyond that a little bit and dig into ourselves. Who do you wish you could be a hero for?
We're checking off God and family because that. So, one of the first things I'm going to lean towards is the deacons of our diocese. Love those guys. They're all trying to serve. They're people that I just hope I'm able to serve them well and to care for them well. They just have a wonderful personality. Every one of them is different, and they're all characters in an awesome way. So they're one of the people that I really, or what groups of people that I feel really called to serve and to, if I can, be growing into a hero for them. But the other group I would mention too is the dads that are there in church. I know what that's like to be there. And, church is an experience that is beautiful, and has a deeper reality. When you're, receiving the Eucharist, of course, you're participating in the heavenly banquet, but we're fallen creatures. And so when we go to Mass, it sometimes feels like sitting still for an hour, which is not always easy. And, I just really want to, as much as I can, kind of help those guys who are, doing what's right for God and what's right for family, and be a resource to them.
What do you counsel men like that who are, like you just said, they're trying to show up for their families and show up for their jobs, and just life is hard, and then they get to mass and then it's just an hour and father goes on forever or the deacon talks forever.
Yeah, usually that deacon, you got to watch out for those deacons.
How do you sit with or counsel, or what are things that you say that
Yeah.
have lit up men going through that?
What I think helps guys to know is that the Mass is an absolutely essential part of our faith. And sometimes it feels like this encounter with Jesus where you're aware, like, wow, I can see that, that incredible experience. And then other times it feels like manna in the desert. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote really compellingly about his experience with the Mass. And sometimes it's uplifting, but sometimes it's just giving you the nourishment that you need to get you to the next Mass. You need to do this. It's critical. But, the Israelites at first, when they got the manna, they said, this is great. What a wonderful thing God's given us. And then, after a few weeks, they're saying, like, this again, God, we got to keep getting this. And, so it's, it doesn't always explode for you. And that's totally okay. The other thing I would add to that too is that the Mass is part of our practice of the faith. It's meant to be part of it. And to really appreciate Mass is going to require seeking perfection in those other critical dimensions of living the faith out, which means understanding the faith more deeply, really growing our understanding of God's intention for us. You're going to participate in all the sacraments, especially reconciliation. The stronger our experience of reconciliation is, the stronger our experience of the Mass is going to be. Then living a dedicated, pure life is going to increase our enjoyment of the Mass. Sometimes I think we forget that we're called to perfection, which doesn't mean that we never make a mistake. That's being immaculate, like Our Lady. But perfection means that we've got everything that we need to be a man. And that means it's a lot of work. And the more that we develop our character as men, the more we're going to enjoy the Mass. And then lastly, prayer. I mean, the Mass is a critical part of our prayer, but it's not supposed to be the only prayer that we do by any means. And the more that we expand our prayer life, the more it's going to enrich us.
Thank you. Could you take like a minute or 30 seconds and talk about that one thing you just said, developing our character as men? What would you say about that?
It's really great. A great resource for this, and maybe we'll talk about this more on another occasion, is I love the St. Michael Chaplet. It's a wonderful prayer. You can find it online. You can find it in most prayer booklets. But as a resource for praying through kind of an examination of conscience, I like to use it, at the start of the day to think about, call myself to be a better man. And then at the end of the day to say, how did I do? So, key elements are, it's love, asking for God's help to truly love him first, to leave the ways of sin and move to perfection, to be humble, to overcome our passions, to be protected from evil, to be protected from temptation, because far too often we kind of want to play with temptation and let it in, but we need protection from that. To ultimately to be obedient, to continue to persevere in faith and good works, and ultimately to realize that our faith's in God's hands, and to seek that time when we're called to be with him.
Thank you. Okay, so now lastly, last question I have to ask about this concept that you come back to over and over and over again, which is the idea of obedience. And for most of the men listening in on this, they're probably married or they might be single. We have very few deacons on our list. This idea of how do I know when I am being obedient to God?
So to be obedient is like to be face to face, to be like close to him, to adore him. And the first step is just to realize that he's always present to us, and to always be talking to him, always be listening to him. That takes time. I'm going to recommend a wonderful book called The Fire Within. It talks about the spirituality of St. Teresa of Avila and St. John. But in that book, Father Dubé talks about how we're all called to the summits of prayer. We're all called to this deep and engaging relationship with God, and it is possible. He will sustain it. He will help us get there. The first step, though, is for us to be open and to say, I want this, because there is part of all of us where we're afraid to fully let him in, because he might not like what he finds there, and that's the first step for us, and to engage in that conversation and to be vulnerable.
Thanks for joining us on Heroic Stories. If this story connected with you, send it to someone. And if you want to chat with us about anything that we've said, head on over to our community at heroicmen.org. We're here for every man out there who feels they're made for more, has the faith to step up, and doesn't know what to do. Come and share your journey with us. Can I share something about a group of men like you? The Heroic Men app is powered by an alliance of supporters. They step up so that others can access life-changing content and community at no cost. Right now, there's another man out there who needs stories and content like this. Maybe he can't even afford a bus fare to Mass. Maybe it's a teen questioning if he matters at all. And maybe it's a father searching for real brotherhood. Your $5 a month covers his ability to access this content. One more soul reached, one more life changed. $5 a month, that's it. If you can, consider paying it forward today. And if you can't, share Heroic Men with another man. That alone could bring another man back to faith in Jesus Christ. And here's how we give even more back to you. Every donor is welcome to join an exclusive group inside our online community. We want to learn from you and work with you to strengthen men so that no man is left behind. Visit heroicmen.org today to stand with us. Someone paid it forward for you. Now will you do the same?